and people will continue joining. Welcome to our webinar with Professor Alex Edmans about his remarkable book, Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Grow Both Purpose and Profit, which has been translated into multiple languages and last month was published in French. I am David Stolen, Professor of Finance at TBS Education in the beautiful city of Toulouse in Southwest France, more about which later. Alex is Professor of Finance at London Business School, which I'm proud to say is also my alma mater. He is an incredibly prolific scholar who has published on a wide range of topics. But at the core of our talk is how companies can grow both purpose and profit. And let's start with a presentation by Alex, after which we will go to our discussion. And please do feel free to post your comments, reactions, questions in the chat. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can send it directly to me. I assume you can do it through chat or just email davidstolen@live.com. Jokes on the chat are also welcome. Just put a smiley so that we know you're not serious. Alex, the screen is yours.
Merci beaucoup, David, pour l'invitation. Je suis très heureux d'être ici. J'ai commencé à apprendre le français à l'âge de 7 ans parce que j'ai visité une école Montessori. Maintenant, mon français est très mauvais parce que je n'ai pas d'occasion de pratiquer. Alors, je dois donner cette présentation en anglais. So you have to start with a joke. My French is a joke right now at this stage. So sadly, I'm going to have to do this in English. But one of the nice things about this was that when I looked at the translation of the Korean and the Chinese version, there was no possibility of commenting it, at least because I started French from a young age. I used to be sort of close to fluent. I was able to comment on the translation, but now sadly, I'm going to have to do this in English. So thank you very much. It's at the end of your day. I'm sure there's many other things you could be doing in your time than getting on another webinar. Thank you for your interest in listening to me about the power of purposeful business. So purpose is something which is bandied around a lot and people talk about it, but they often talk about the moral and ethical case. So David and I are both narrow, hard-hearted finance professors, yet the reason that we can be so passionate about purpose is not just the moral and ethical arguments, but the business and financial arguments. So why can that be? And how can we have a financial argument? Because normally we think about the moral argument. Well, that might be because I have a different view as to what it means for a company to be purposeful than what you typically hear. And to show this different view, let me start you with an example. So let's go back by 20 years to the telecoms company Vodafone in the UK. So they were noticing that in Kenya, Kenyan citizens in 2003 were using their phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. And this gave them an idea. What if we could develop a technology that would allow people to transfer not mobile minutes, but actual cash? So at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. They had to rely on cash, which could be forged, it could be lost, or it could be stolen. So if Vodafone could pull it off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, they launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya, which allows people to transfer money to each other from phone to phone just as easily as we could transfer a text message. Now, that was something which created a huge amount of value for society. It lifted 200,000 people out of poverty in the first 7 years. And many of these households were headed up by women because it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a large effect on gender equality. And the nice coda to this is that even though Vodafone created M-Pesa to solve a social problem of financial inclusion in Kenya, ultimately, the company was able to benefit. They were able to turn it into a profit, even though profits were not their motivation. So they became more profitable, even though their motive was purpose, it was serving wider society. So why am I starting my talk with this? It seems like a feel-good story, But it's more than a story, it's to answer these two questions, which will highlight the different view of purpose that I'm hoping to be highlighting today. So let's think about these two questions. The first is, how much value did M-Pesa create for society? And the second is, if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa, what would have been the public outrage or damage to Vodafone's ESG rating? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here because, as David says, there'll be lots of time at the end for questions. And the reason for not polling people is that most people agree with the answers. So how much value did M-Pesa create for society? A huge amount of value. Right, this lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender equality. But what would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. There would have been no customer boycott. There would have been no media backlash. Nobody would have ever complained because they would have never thought it was even possible to do this crazy idea of banking without a bank. And so this is my different view of purpose, which I would like to highlight today. So often people think that purpose is about answering the second question. We should do no harm. We should not cheat on taxes. We should not pollute the environment. We should not mistreat our employees. And please don't get me wrong, like, part of purpose is indeed doing no harm. But I like to say that it's not enough to do that. Companies must actively do good and address the first question and create value for society, even if there were no societal expectations to do that. So why? Well, one reason is the moral and ethical case. Given the challenges of the world today, it's not enough for a company to say, I am doing no harm. Instead, I need to do good and contribute towards solving the challenges, not just fail to exacerbate them. But that is a moral and ethical argument, and I said I would focus on the business argument. And what does the business and financial argument about answering the second question? It's about good risk management. But a purposeful company should not be in a scandal. We don't want to be like Vodafone, like Volkswagen with a emission scandal, or Rio Tinto blowing up Juukan Gorge. But if indeed purpose is about risk management, we want to do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal. There's no point in going above and beyond. Yet what is the financial and business case for actively creating value? It could be huge. Why? Because if you create value for society, ultimately, if you're creating value for society, people will pay you for it. And this later on translates into a profit, just like Vodafone created M-Pesa to solve the issue of financial inclusion, but it was later able to monetize it. And so this is now linked to the idea of the pie, which is the theme of the book. So what is the pie? We often think that the pie is the value a company creates. We can divide it between profits to investors, that's the blue, and value to society, that's the orange. And often people think that purpose is about splitting the pie differently. For example, donating some profits and paying higher wages than you need to, or maybe giving something to charity. And obviously, fairness and equality, that is part of purpose, but it needs to be more than that, because if purpose is just about redistributing the pie, then there's no business case for it, right? Companies won't willingly want to do it. Why? Because if I'm purposeful, I'm reducing my profits. And so this is why we have the concern of greenwashing. You might have a lot of companies that say nice things, I'm going to serve wider society, but they don't actually put it into practice. And why would we? Why would I want to do something which makes my company less profitable? So this is why my view is that purpose is about growing the pie. So absolutely, it's about increasing the orange. But the way that we increase the orange is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but it's through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. Because even if those ideas are motivated by creating value for society, not to make money, ultimately, if you do create value for society, you are able to monetize. Now, at this point in my talk, sort of halfway in, you might think, well, everything I say, it sounds great, but it seems a bit like wishful thinking. Where is the evidence? But it would be amazing if creating value for society magically led to profit. But isn't this a bit too good to be true? And I have shown you one example of one company where it worked, which is Vodafone. But how do you know that I didn't handpick that one company because it supports my view? So what I want to look at is large-scale evidence. And so this is our main job, David and I, as both academic researchers, is not to tell stories. Obviously, stories are important, but to say, well, is a story backed up by large-scale data? So my question, is purpose something that pays off? Now, the challenge is, well, how do we measure purpose? We can look at companies having nice purpose statements, but they might not put it into practice. So then you might think, well, can we look at, do companies put their money where their mouth is? How much do they spend on corporate social responsibility? But that's not good, because you could spend a lot by giving lots of money to charity, but you might not give to the right charities. So instead, we can look at the output. So what the output is, well, how much value do you actually deliver, not how much money do you spend? And so what I chose to look at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So these are companies that go above and beyond in how they treat their workers. So it's not just about avoiding injuries and strikes, but it's about providing a healthy and enriching workplace. That's linked to my idea that purpose is about doing, it's about actively doing good, not just doing no harm. You might think, well, why do I look at workers? Isn't climate the biggest crisis that we have today? And obviously climate is really important. However, climate is something which might matter for some companies, let's say energy and transport, but not for others, let's say tech. Whereas employees, they matter in nearly every company. And so what I found was the companies that went above and beyond in how they treated their workers, they beat their peers in terms of total shareholder return by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% compounded. And if we step back from the numbers, what does this actually mean in terms of the bottom line for practitioners? Well, companies that are treating their workers well, they're not just being fluffy and nice and humane, they're being commercially savvy, they're investing in their most important asset that grows the pie, leading to greater shareholder return. Now, you may wonder, is this causation? Employee satisfaction leads to better performance, or maybe it's reverse causality. Maybe once a company's already performing well, it leads to happier employees. Or maybe you have third factors that drive both. Maybe if you're in the tech industry, employees are happy, and also the tech industry has done well. So again, big part of the research process is to rebut the alternative explanations, but I'm not going to bore you with how I do that. Instead, I'm going to end the talk with, well, how we put this into practice, which is most relevant for those who are practitioners among you. So, first part of my talk, purpose is about actively doing good, not doing no harm. Second part is it can lead to superior financial performance. It's not at the expense of it. The third is how do we do it? Let me just drill down a little bit as to what it means for a company to be purposeful. So many companies have purpose statements that look like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. Now, that sounds great. We serve everybody, but it's not realistic because there are trade-offs. It could be that you help the environment by shutting down a polluting plant, but that ends up being harmful to workers because they lose their job. And indeed, if you look at the word purpose in the English language, it is about focus. It's not about being all things to all people. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. I believe that the French translation might be raison d'être, right? A reason for being, not 100 reasons. And indeed, that's how I define purpose in the English version. Why a company exists, who it serves, its raison d'être, and the role that it plays in the world. So a purpose should never be to address all 17 sustainable development goals, but to focus on the 3 or 4 that really move the needle. So how do we decide what to focus on? Well, if there's only one thing you remember from my talk, I hope it says this. Ask yourself, what is in my hand? By this, I mean, what are the resources, what is the expertise that my company has, and how can I use this to serve society if I think just a little bit more creatively? Now, Vodafone, what was in their hands was their telecoms expertise, and they were able to use that and leverage that rather than to use just transforming text messages. They instead use this for mobile money. So what does this mean in practice? There could be 3 parts that I'll end with before closing up. The first is it involves doing new things. Right, so new business generation driven by the desire to serve clients. So one part of this is new products and services for existing clients. So often businesses think, well, I need to solve problems. There's demand out there. Let's try to satisfy this demand. But problem finding is about finding a solution to a problem that you did not even know about. Nobody was asking Vodafone to create mobile money, but they thought, well, how can I use what is in our hand, our expertise, and use this to serve wider society? Okay. So you might think, well, doesn't every company want to develop new products and services? And the answer is yes, but a purposeful company will develop new products and services, even if it doesn't see a bottom line benefit of doing this. So what drives you is, can I serve society with this innovation, not can I make money? And the same might be to try to find new clients. For example, I know some banks who are trying to focus on minority entrepreneurship. Why? The purpose of a bank is as financial empowerment, to allow people to start businesses who might not otherwise do that. But mostly, who gets funded as entrepreneurs, it might be white males. Why companies don't have a track record if they're new, and therefore you might go by the confidence of the entrepreneur, which might automatically bias your decisions towards white male candidates. So there are banks which try to specifically target funding minority entrepreneurs. Now they do this because they think it's the right thing to do to help society. But again, ultimately they might benefit because if they're able to find clients that otherwise people might not, then they will get an advantage. Just like with some football teams, the first football teams to hire black players, they were able to get some great players, which maybe other teams were overlooking. But the second idea is to do the same thing, but in different ways. And this is really important because often people think, well, purpose is all about innovation. I've highlighted innovation so far, but there's a limit to how much you innovate. But even if you don't do any innovation, just to do your core business in an excellent way is hugely purposeful. So I do some work with Network Rail in the UK, which runs the trains. And one thing they want to do for Help Society, that involves things such as making sure that there's not too much graffiti in the stations. Now, that's obviously important, but just the core business of making sure the trains run on time, that is hugely purposeful. That has so much more of a benefit than reducing the amount of graffiti. And what about David's and my job as being a finance professor? Well, part of this job involves teaching, which both of us are hugely passionate about. And so for me at London Business School, how do I add value? It's not by the fact that I take public transport to my lectures rather than driving, but preparing for every class to make sure that it's rigorous, but also interesting. Now, you might think, shouldn't every company try to be excellent? But companies will only try to be excellent if they see a profit from doing it, whereas a purposeful company will pursue excellence even if there's no clear benefit. So as a finance professor, you are mainly evaluated according to your research. If you were a rational professor, you wouldn't care about teaching. However, this is something that both David and I care about passionately, why we view our purpose as being not just the creation of knowledge through research, but the dissemination of knowledge through teaching, through webinars such as this. And final thing is to do the same thing in the same way. Well, that's not innovative, but to recognize the purpose of what you're doing. So I'm sure some of you will have seen this graphic. 3 people are doing the same thing, but they describe it differently. The first gentleman says, I am laying bricks. The second says, I am making a living. The third says, I'm building a cathedral. So they're all doing the same thing, but one of them sees the ultimate purpose. And so why I think this is interesting is by seeing how what you do affects wider society, that can have a huge effect on the meaning of what you do and then your motivation and therefore generally the company's culture. So one bank that I work with is NatWest, a UK high street bank. And after the pandemic was over, the CEO, Alison Rose, took the senior management team out to a restaurant, the Darjeeling Express in Covent Garden. And the owner of the restaurant gave a little talk saying, well, when I came to the UK in the 1990s, nobody believed in me. I was a woman, I was an immigrant. Immigrant women just did not get loans from banks. But you, NatWest, you believed in me. I was able to launch this restaurant, serve hundreds of customers, so hire also dozens of employees. Now, if you were the NatWest employee who processed the loan, you probably thought, I'm just doing some financial analysis. I put some into the reject basket, others to the accept basket. I don't really care. But your decision ultimately allowed an entrepreneur to fulfill her dream, to help her colleagues and to help customers as well. And so often we don't see the ultimate purpose of what we do, but certainly people who are senior in the organization who are able to bring that back into the company, that can make a huge effect. I know that when I started out at Morgan Stanley, I would often not go to meetings because I was so junior. But if my boss called me from the meeting and said, hey, you know the analysis you did, it came up in the meeting, the client was impressed by what we did, that was something which made a huge difference to me. Okay, so just to wrap up, as David mentioned, this book was published in French a month ago, and it's called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. Huge pleasure to be able to have this event to commemorate this launch with TBS. So let me hand back to David for the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alex. If you're just tuning in, I'm David Stolen, and this is a webinar with Professor Alex Edmonds, organized by TBS Education, about his book, Grow the Pie, just published in French. Now, TBS Education, formerly Toulouse Business School, actually yesterday celebrated its 120th anniversary. Before I start with questions, I want to stress that TBS is fully committed to sustainability. In fact, TBS often uses the backronym Together Building Sustainability. But TBS is also fully committed to intellectual freedom and academic debate. So all questions and points of view are welcome as we discuss these very important issues. And they did prepare a number of questions for Alex, but we have already received, even before the seminar, we received some questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with one of those, which might seem quite simple, but how do you define sustainable finance? I'm going to throw in also, there is ESG, there is CSR, there is sustainable finance. Now there is pie economics and growing the pie. How do you define them, and how do they interrelate?
Yeah, so there's lots of different definitions out there, and I know there are some people who say, oh, there's a difference between responsible business and sustainable business and so on. I always see this as just creating long-term value. And in fact, I have a recent paper called The End of ESG, which sort of says get rid of the ESG term, because ESG issues are actually not different from any other business issue. Its core business is about creating long-term sustainable value. And I see sort of responsibility, economics, all of them, they're all being pretty similar. Then you might think, well, why did I write the book at all if this is just mainstream capitalism? It's because of this idea of if you do want to maximize long-term value, it might not be something that you should do directly, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, what finance professors like David and I teach is in order to maximize shareholder value, you form a spreadsheet, you calculate the cash flows from an investment, and you see, does this improve shareholder value? But actually, it might be quite difficult to do that, right? So let's think about Vodafone and M-Pesa. That would have never been justified with a spreadsheet. The tech challenges were huge. Would it work? And even if it did work, where would the money be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world? So what economics looks at is trying to look at profit as a byproduct of serving wider societies. Let's first start by deciding to create social value. And then if we create social value, then as a byproduct, financial value will be improving. So I think all of the terms that you mentioned, they are all suggesting that in the long term, financial and social value are aligned. And that I can see also in some of the questions in the webinar chat. But is the alignment meaning that we should pursue profit? And think if we pursue profit, then we will be socially responsible. Or is it the other way around? Let's pursue social responsibility, and if we do that, then we will be profitable. And I'm more advocating the latter as the more practical way to address these issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. And what I'm going to try to do is maybe I'll alternate my questions with questions from the webinar chat and some that ChatGPT is very eager to ask. Just by way of introducing my question and plugging a little bit our wonderful school, TBS has campuses in Paris, Barcelona, Casablanca, but it's anchored in the city of Toulouse, which actually punches well above its weight in architecture, rugby, cuisine, education, and also in the history of capitalism. And what's arguably the world's first corporation in the modern sense of the word, the Société des Moulins de Bazacle, operated a group of mills on the Garonne River in Toulouse as far back as the 14th century. Now, a few years ago, Alex was the keynote speaker at a conference TBS organized, and we visited the site where the mills used to be, and my colleague David Debris told us about his research into these mills. What's striking is that the governance structure of the company 7 centuries ago was similar to that of companies today. It was dispersed shareholders and a board that acts in their interest to make important decisions, including appointing CEOs. Now, interestingly, the milling company paid dividends in the form of sacks of flour, which presumably its shareholders wanted to maximize. But it also played a very beneficial role in Toulouse society, helping to feed its population. And as a side remark, the words merchant and market actually have the same Latin origin as the word mercy. They're all related to the Latin merx, which meant commodity or merchandise. So since the 14th century, there have been countless corporations, and there are those who would argue that these corporations have helped create the imperfect but infinitely better world that we live in today, even if typically these corporations' main goal presumably was profit. Improving the world was a byproduct. Now, Alex, you're making the reverse argument that if companies focus intelligently on improving the world, following your principles, they will likely end up improving their shareholder value as a byproduct. In your book, you cite statistical evidence as well as examples of how aiming just for profits can harm society and how companies trying to benefit society benefit profits. But your book goes further and essentially is arguing for a world where as many companies as possible are consistently looking after the public good. And of course, in a highly intelligent manner and according to the principles that you have set out. Do we have enough hard evidence to say that this world is better than a world where companies are maximizing their profits, of which a portion then finances governments and NGOs could then look after the public good, also, of course, in a highly intelligent manner.
Yeah, this is a very important question, David, because many people think, and this is Milton Friedman's view as well, that companies should just focus on profits because profits then are a social good. Those profits can be used to donate to give to taxes or to donate to charities. And what people might have just bristled at my mention of Milton Friedman, let me stress that Milton Friedman's argument is much more nuanced than people argue. Why he said that businesses should only focus on profits is not because he was hard-hearted and didn't care about the societal issues, but he was arguing, just as you did, David, that maybe if you generate maximum profits, you're paying maximum taxes. Governments can address a lot of these issues through taxes and subsidies, and then it allows shareholders to donate their profits to charities. And I think there's a lot to be said for this argument. However, the main weakness of that argument is there are certain things in which the company has a comparative advantage in addressing. So let me give you an example. So if a company were to invest in reducing its plastic packaging, that would have a much greater effect than if it was to donate its profits to charity, let's say Greenpeace, and Greenpeace used it to lobby for a tax on plastic bags or something like that. So if it's something that you can control directly, then I believe that you should do it within the company. But then after that, once you've taken sort of all the extent of your actions that you can control directly, then the rest of it, that you shouldn't be ashamed of having that as profits, paying your fair taxes, and then allowing your shareholders to support the social causes they want to support. And the nice idea of donating to charity is it's democratic. So if you, David, and I are both shareholders of a company, I might care about cancer research, you care about animal rights. I could donate then to a cancer charity and you could donate to an animal rights charity.
Thank you. I'm going to alternate my questions with questions from the chat. And there's a question, there's been over 40 years of research in accounting that shows increased social and environmental performance leads to increased financial performance. Regardless, companies are not motivated to change. Most of this is seen in corporate reporting, ESG. How does growing the pie deal with the political reality of entrenched management and shareholder interests for the status quo?
Well, first, thank you very much for that question. So in terms of the evidence, I think there was probably 40 years of research showing that these things were correlated with each other, but to actually show a causal relationship from social and environmental performance to financial performance, that was much more difficult because those correlations, it's not clear what actually causes what. And so even if you find a correlation, it could be financial performance leads to social performance. I think it's only much more recently that you've been able to find evidence that you can attribute as close to causal. But point number two is that even if you agree with all of that evidence, the correlation between these is only true in the long term. So the pie is fixed in the short term. If I invest in my employees, that reduces my profits in the short term. Now, it's true that in the long term that these employees will be more motivated and more productive and long-term profits will rise, but it may well be that there's short-termism within the system. So what do I mean by within the system? Who's short-termist here? Well, it could be that the CEO is short-termist because they're evaluated according to quarterly profits. Or maybe the CEO is long-term, but investors are short-termists because asset managers may only care about sort of quarterly performance or annual performance to affect fund flows. And it might not be even asset managers, maybe it's asset owners such as pension funds who are short-termists, why maybe the pension fund manager is themselves evaluated according to how the fund is doing and so forth, how the investments are doing. So somewhere in the system, there might be some short-termism. So I think what's important is not just to convince people of the alignment between societal and financial value, but to put long-term incentives inside the system to ensure that people have this long-term mindset. So there's one chapter of the book in particular, chapter 5, on the importance of incentives. And while people often focus on the level of CEO pay, I think that the horizon of pay is more important for the reasons just given, that only in the long term do you see the alignment that you see in the question.
And the book indeed has a lot more on these. We'll have to switch gears precisely because the book is so wide-ranging, the questions are wide-ranging. I'm going to try to be, in the interest of efficiency, I'll combine a chat question with one of my own. The question is about purpose. I'm wondering if you have any insight into why we currently have such a narrow interpretation of corporate purpose. Additionally, how can we create incentives for businesses to voluntarily redefine their purpose and expand their scope beyond just maximizing shareholder returns? I'm going to combine this with a question of mine, and also continuing with the Toulouse theme. Our city is also known as an aviation capital, given that the metropolitan area is home to Airbus. And by the way, those of you who are planning to visit Toulouse or live in Toulouse and haven't done this, I highly recommend the Airbus factory tour. I'm not a shareholder there, I'm honestly recommending this. Airbus's latest annual report formally states its purpose multiple times as pioneering sustainable airspace for a safe and united world. And in fact, the Airbus annual report itself is titled Connecting and Protecting. Now, its rival Boeing's mission statement, and so presumably its purpose, reads to connect, protect, explore, and inspire the world through airspace innovation. So there is something of a theme there. It seems to be a connector, protector sector. Is it necessary for companies in the same industry to differentiate themselves with respect to their purpose? And if it is, how should they go about it?
Okay, I think these are two really good questions again. So let me start with Sylvie's question in the chat and then get to yours. So why do we have such a narrow interpretation? I think many people just have the pie splitting mentality that purpose is at the expense of profits. And it's easy to point fingers at other people, but if you point a finger at somebody, 3 fingers point back at you. And so what do we often teach as academics? Well, if you learn in a PhD class, you maximize profits by holding down employees to the outside option, right? So we often have this view of a fixed pie, and because this is so ingrained in us, often we think that purpose and profit are misaligned. I also am quite perturbed by the debate that we see in the United States, where ESG has been political, where people think, okay, if you're a Democrat, you care about society, you should care about ESG. If you're a Republican, you should care about profits, you should therefore not care about ESG. But if, as I mentioned, ESG is about just creating long-term value, then this should be something which everybody is aligned to. And I have to say, I think that sometimes Democrats or ESG advocates are part of the problem, because they say, oh, you dumb person, or you're anti-ESG, you must be a Republican. Well, in fact, a Republican should be pro-ESG because you're about creating long-term company success. So often we like to call out other people, not realizing that they should be allies with us, because everybody, irrespective of your political orientation, clearly want companies to be more successful rather than less. And then now gets to the second part of the question, which is David's question as to should we really focus on purpose being unique, or if it's the same industry, can we actually get any differentiation at all? And to me, I think what really matters is not so much the statement of the purpose, but the execution. So lots of companies spend a lot of effort in trying to have a snazzy purpose statement, but then people wonder, is this for marketing reasons than actually genuine reasons? For example, all professors, we're all in the same industry. Maybe all of us have the same purpose of creating and disseminating knowledge, but the question is, do you really care about teaching when it is that the incentives are just to publish in the top academic journals? Do you spend time providing comments on other people's papers when the incentives are just to focus on your own paper, and so forth? So the same is, I think, true in companies. So sometimes people might get overly obsessed with trying to make their statement unique, and that can backfire. So in the UK, Unilever was often seen as a big champion of purpose, so they had a sustainable living plan, Paul Polman, the legendary CEO, but there was this investor, Terry Smith, who's a very respected investor, focuses on long-term value, says, well, why do you try to come up with the purpose of mayonnaise? Right, the purpose of mayonnaise is sandwiches. Right, there's no higher purpose than putting it in sandwiches. So sometimes we just focus too much on sort of the nice statement of purpose, when actually, if you just did your job of making the mayonnaise healthy and affordable, that might be enough to create value for society. So it's often the execution, not so much the statement.
And this also means that you partially answered two questions that arrived before the seminar started, but maybe you might want to comment on them, especially the second one. First question is, what is the best way for a board of directors to deal with ESG pressures? And the second question is, how to hack ESG and make it effortless for businesses? We in Asia find it an expensive affair and the geopolitical games play.
Wow. Okay. Again, great question. So the first one is, well, how does a board sort of think about and how do you try to address ESG issues? I think the first thing is just to define a company's purpose. And so what I think that's important, that highlights what are the ESG issues that you think you will focus on, and realize that you're not here to solve every single one of the world's problems. So if a board defines a purpose statement like the one that I had earlier to serve customers, workers, employees, and so on, I think you've lost the battle, because then you need to solve every single one of the world's problems, and then you're always held accountable for every single issue. But I think as a board, if you state your purpose as something much more narrowly defined, then that's something where it helps with decision making. For example, going back to NatWest, like they said, our purpose is to champion the potential of people. That is vague, that is broad and sweeping. But then they say there's three particular areas in which we want to do this. Number one is climate, so financing the climate transition. Number two, entrepreneurship. And number three, financial education and financial literacy. And so this helps them in terms of decision making, because that says, well, if there's a project which is contributing to one of those three objectives, then we're much more likely to focus on it. Whereas if instead, as a board, your goal was to address all 17 SDGs, that doesn't tell you where you should be allocating capital and where you should be putting capital. So how to hack ESG, and I think it's nice that you tie these questions together, David. I think it's linked to the first one, is why is it so complicated? You think, well, there's so many ESG reporting standards out there that I need to address, and there's so many metrics that I need to tick. But I don't think as a company you need to tick every single box. So it's just like I try to think about this as a finance professor. So on the one hand, there might be pressure for me to attend every single PhD student seminar within LBS, but I just realize I don't have expertise to comment on certain research topics like theoretical asset pricing. So I'd much rather give this talk to a different school, TBS. Why? Because this is able to use what's in my hand, which is my expertise in responsible business. And so as a company, well, I think the hack is to realize that purpose is about being focused. I'd say that hack number two is to try to make sure that purpose, or ESG, or whatever you call it, is not divorced from the business. So often people think, okay, in order to show that I'm purposeful, I must do something completely different. Let me build a fire station in the local community. Let me run some employee volunteering program. But if you can integrate ESG, your purpose, within the core business, so for me, it might be integrating research into my teaching. For David, it might be to incorporate humor into your teaching to make the classes just more entertaining and more impactful. It's not necessarily doing something on the side which is quite separate from teaching and research. I think whenever it's connected to the core business, then it's something where it's not seen as an optional extra, and sort of then the problems with the trade-off between the core business and ESG become more painful when ESG is not part of the core business.
And now, if we return to the Airbus and Boeing setting, And I'll be the devil's advocate here. I'd like to go with a thought experiment. And please tell me if it's too far-fetched or if it's a misunderstanding of the grow the pie idea. But let's say that Airbus and Boeing both buy fully into the pie growing mentality. And they realize, for example, that it would be pie growing if they shared even more safety relevant data with one another. I don't think many would argue against that. But then if they truly focus on societal benefit, they might also think it's beneficial if their engineering team shared their breakthroughs. And maybe it would further help if they pooled their resources and built much more advanced factories together instead of separately, let's say, in order to make radically less polluting airplanes. And in fact, if they really wanted to maximize their impact on society, which they both want to connect and to protect, it might even make sense for their management to join forces and have a single management team. If their investors likewise want to benefit society, they might cheer as well. And if the antitrust authorities now also care not only about the impact on consumers, but about the overall society, including pollution reduction, then their threshold for blocking such a merger might now be higher. So you can see where this is going, and I don't want to caricature too much, but the ostensible goal of central planners in communist countries like the Soviet Union, where I grew up, was to maximize societal value. And of course, that killed competition and it rendered companies stunningly inefficient, which in turn destroyed societal value. So in a world where every business seeks to maximize societal value, there would be some blunting of competition reminiscent of central planning, not 100%, but more than we have now. Is this completely far-fetched? What would be your response to this thought experiment?
Yes, my response would be, I think I understand that the benefits from this, and I think often collaboration can help. And there's parts of the book talking about collaboration between companies or collaboration between investors. But the important downside is incentives, right? So we often need incentives to grow the pie. In particular, if growing the pie involves innovation, we want something which is going to be spurring us on. And the problem with the system in which sort of everything is shared and there's a lack of competition is there may not be the incentives to do that. Like if you know that I can just tread water, stick with the status quo, then I might not be innovative. And so there are examples of companies which have significantly just shrunk the pie due to being, I think, just lazy and complacent. So Kodak, when the Sony digital camera first came around, they just didn't respond. They thought, okay, we are just fat and happy here with huge amounts of revenues from film. Even if there's a threat and even if digital cameras come, it's not going to come for 10 years, an internal report suggested. And so they just didn't bother and they never responded to it. Had it been that the threat was more imminent, or had they not had such a large monopoly position or dominant position in film, they might have had to take the threat more seriously and responded to this. So I think the main challenge to this is incentives. So this is why I think the competitive market economy is a good one. Why profits, at least long-term profits, are good signals for what society wants. Why is it that many companies are moving from petrol cars to electric cars? Well, you'd hope some of them are doing it because they care about the planet, but some are doing it because they're responding to profit signals, because the profit signal for making electric cars is much better. And given competition, then they want to be the ones who are capitalizing on this financial opportunity.
Thank you, Alex. We have a question from ChatGPT, and fittingly, it's about the future. And it's, how do you see the future of purpose-driven business evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, it's amazing what ChatGPT came up with. There were some fantastic questions there on the list. So how do I see the future? I think purpose will be seen hopefully as much more integrated within companies, and also seen as much more focused. So you've had from one extreme, maybe the purpose of a corporation even just 10 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, it might have been just to focus on shareholder value. Now people realize the importance of serving wider society, but then some now have, I think, two broad purposes is trying to address all the stakeholder issues in the world. And so what I hope to have is a happy medium where people realize the importance of a purpose beyond just profit, but they also realize the need for a purpose to be focused. And I think this is how many things sort of come about. You swing from like one extreme to the other extreme, and then in the end you get somewhere which is a happy medium. What is great is there has been a lot of energy behind focusing on societal issues. I think that sometimes people have got overly excited about it, and they've not realized that actually it is important to still keep an eye on profit, and so you might end up somewhere in the middle, hopefully, in the future.
Thank you. Your book concludes with advice to enterprises, investors, and citizens. What is your advice to NGOs, in particular, as they approach enterprises for funding or collaboration?
Yeah, so first, I'd have to say any advice that I give to NGOs has to be caveated in that my expertise as a finance professor is looking at publicly traded companies. That's where I have the data. And that's particularly important for me because often you can measure long-term performance with the stock price. What's nice about the stock price is you can do risk adjustment and so on. With an NGO, you don't have as clear a performance measure, and so I'm not able to directly speak with as much authority on them. However, what I can try and do is apply similar principles from publicly traded companies with the acknowledgement that maybe they don't fully apply. And I think one important principle, I think, is just the same in terms of focus. So why does focus matter? Often, given the scale of the world's challenges today, we might think, well, as an NGO, if we are to claim we're going to solve more problems rather than fewer, then we might get actually more funding. And indeed, as some foundation, you might want to claim that you're ticking more boxes. But I think your responsibility as an NGO is to focus on the societal issues that you are best placed to solve. An intelligent donor will be one who realizes they don't need to put all their money to one NGO. They could spread it across many different ones, which is the idea of diversification. That is something which will hopefully apply to NGOs and charitable organizations as much as it might do to portfolio selection. I would rather have one great cancer charity, one great diabetes charity, one great animal rights charity, and give to those three separate charities rather than NGOs trying to solve all of those things together.
Great, and this also leads us to our field, which is finance. And there are industries like food or medicine or transportation where defining purpose, one could say, is relatively more straightforward. But we teach finance. Our students disproportionately go to work in the finance industry. And I could try to define the purpose of an archetypal finance company and of the industry taken in aggregate as our purpose is to help other businesses fulfill their purpose. But that's once removed. That's a less direct definition. And in other words, it seems like there can be a lack of correlation how purposeful a company is and how purposeful it is perceived to be by its stakeholders. And as your book argues, perceptions matter. So do you agree with this assessment? Do you have solutions for the fact that purpose is kind of more readily expressible for some types of businesses than for others?
Yes, I do. And the financial sector is a great example of that, David, because when people think, okay, what am I doing in terms of a company? Well, as a clothing company, you're making clothes. As a toy company, you're making toys. But as finance, you're not really doing anything. So you talk about comedy. At Wharton, where I was an assistant professor, they have this comedy musical every year called The Follies. And every year they ask a couple of professors to act and do a couple of songs or skits. And I was in one of them where I was advising some students on careers, and all these students wanted to go into finance careers. And I came up with this line: have you ever thought of working for a company that actually makes something? And then the students sort of laughed because, we realize, yes, what we're doing as a bank, we're not actually making anything. But the enabling power that you speak about, David, is, I think, where it goes through. And just to highlight, well, what are we doing as NatWest? We are allowing the Darjeeling Expresses to come about. Or what might we do as a merger and acquisitions bank? I know one of the directors of NatWest, who previously was at an investment bank and worked on the AstraZeneca merger. And then when AstraZeneca became a company to give a vaccine out for free, he was really proud. Now, obviously, there's not a direct causation between that merger and them having the COVID vaccine, but it certainly would have helped if it made the company, or gave the company with scale. You talk about collaboration in your communism question, and sort of indeed one of the benefits of mergers is if you did have that scale. And I think just to highlight that, and I think the power of stories is really useful. So as an academic, I used to be very snobbish about it before writing the book and before talking to practitioners. I used to think the power is the regression coefficient, that large-scale data. This is what we do as academics, but that just does not connect with people, right? It doesn't matter how robust your regression is. It doesn't matter how exogenous your identification is. That's not going to connect. Whereas the power of something like the M-Pesa story or the NatWest story, that I think makes a big difference. Many people will know Zappos. This is a story of a company. This is a company which has stories of great customer service. They will tell those stories around. Now, the story should be backed up by large-scale data, but the story is important to get people to lean in. So to understand, well, what does a bank do? It merges companies together. Well, what does merging do? It doesn't just make bankers rich. It allows now the AstraZenecas to form, and now it has scale to do R&D, or you're financing an entrepreneur to achieve her ambitions.
That's a great penultimate answer, and our time is almost up. There is one question about, will there be a recording of this meeting available? And if all goes well, yes. And my last question, also we can make it open-ended, anything you want to add. I suppose that following the publication of the book, ideas or examples or stories have come up that you wish you could have included and presumably would want to include in the next edition. What would be at the top of that list, and also anything else, that any other points that we haven't brought up yet?
Yeah, so I already have added some examples. So the book first came out in March 2020, which was the worst time to launch a book. I had so many book launches lined up, and then there was the pandemic, which happened. And then the paperback happens, normally comes out 18 months later. It's just the same normally as the hardback, but I actually updated it significantly for all of the examples that I could think of, which had companies which were acting purposefully in the pandemic. I think that was really important, because often people think, well, purpose is a luxury that you can only do in really good times. If you're in a pandemic, you can't really do it, but there were examples of companies that did many things. It could be you're a perfume manufacturer. What is in your hand? It's alcohol-based products. You now use that to make sanitizer. I think in terms of the new things, the NatWest story that I just told about the Darjeeling Express, that is something which is, I think, is highlighted the importance of just telling stories, doing the same thing, even if you do the same thing in the same way, recognize the ultimate purpose. And the more and more I talk to companies about purpose, the more like inspired I become. One of the nice things about the book being translated into so many languages is I then hear stories from other countries. I just gave a talk in South Korea a week ago, and then was able to talk about how LG Electronics in the pandemic used what's in the hand to devise a robot to use to disinfect surfaces using ultraviolet light. And now that there's the French version out, hopefully I'll have many more conversations with French companies, and I can add some French examples too. So if there becomes a third edition, then it will become even more global.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, our allotted time is up. Thank you so much, Alex. This has been a great pleasure, hugely enjoyable. This is an ideas-packed book. We have only touched on a fraction of them. It's a beautifully written book. It combines academic rigor and engaging anecdotes. It's thought-provoking. It's at times it's funny, at times it's poignant. And to top it off, there's a wonderful audiobook version narrated by Alex himself. Before you do anything else, order it. You will not be sorry. And if you're at TBS, the book is available at the library in English and in French, both in hard copy and electronically. Thank you again, Alex. Thank you, all our listeners. Goodbye and à bientôt.
Thanks so much, David. It's really great to have this conversation with you, but also your time and your preparation was not only in giving this this interview and preparing for it, but all of the work done to set this up to begin with. And thank you for those of you at TBS behind the scenes who've also helped out with that. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.